Welcome to Innovation Leadership. I'm Jess Larsen. This is another episode of Hollywood Explained with my co-host, Laura Walker-Lee, CEO at AG Capital in the film finance world and at Monterey Ventures in the venture world, and Andy Horowitz. He's a famous producer and a CEO of Big Swell Entertainment. Guys, welcome back.
Thanks for having us back.
Thank
Excited
you.
to see your faces again. It's been too long.
So I know we talked about this episode diving into IP. Andy, why don't you kick us off and talk about IP and let's maybe even start with Suicide Squad and the role it played there.
Yeah, I think in Hollywood, IP is king. I think it will sort of always be king. I think if you go back, 50, 60 years, there's still movies that are based on books, very famous movies based on books and plays and all sorts of things. IP is something that is kind of the most sought after thing in Hollywood because it's the easiest sell, but it's also, I think we've come to a place in Hollywood where there's just not a lot of it left to mine. We've mined it, and then we've mined versions of it, and then mined versions of it. And, I think we are starting to get to a place in town where people are having a little bit of IP fatigue as it relates to sequels and universes and all sorts of things that have starting to lose studios a tremendous amount of money this summer. I think as we've seen with Indiana Jones and Mission Impossible and IP is something that is it's just very important in Hollywood. It's something, like I said, that is a side of the business, especially as a producer, that we are always chasing IP because I think I've said this before, but studios love IP because it mitigates risk. And I think at the end of the day, that's really what basing movies on IP is about. It's mitigating risk. It's knowing that, there are a certain amount of people that have bought the book or watched are aware of the story or read the article, and the studios can look at that amount of people and go, okay, well, we're at least going to get that many people to come see the movie when it opens opening weekend because we know there's a pre-existing fan base. Anyone else that comes is sort of a bonus for us. And so they can then look at those numbers in terms of the sales for the books or the toy sales or whatever they may be and say, okay, we're comfortable spending this amount of money on the movie because we know we'll get this amount of people to come. These are the loyal fans. And so that's really, as far as the way I look at it, is it's about mitigating risk, but it's also about, sort of bringing stories and characters to a new audience and a new generation. And I think, the Ninja Turtle movie that just came out is a really good example of that. When I was a kid, let's call it 30, 35 years ago, I was Ninja Turtle crazy. It was amazing. The video games and the cartoons and the actual live action movies that they made, I loved them. And that franchise and those characters have been pretty dormant, at least for the last 10 years. They tried to reboot those movies about 10 years ago in the live action space, did a pretty good job, but then they kind of just disappeared. And now if you look what's happening with the animated movie that just came out a week and a half ago, and the animated movie is doing pretty well. It's not doing incredibly well, but it's doing good enough. But that animated movie translated into over $1 billion of sales for the toys and the consumer products for Ninja Turtles. And so that is a whole new generation that is now buying toys and playing video games and getting into those characters. So it's just I think that all of it goes back to mitigating risk. It really does. And, when I was at Atlas for many years, we produced a lot of DC films when I was there. And of course, that's, one of the most prized jewels of the IP world in Hollywood. I think it sort of has probably the most recognizable characters, that and Marvel, of course. And I really enjoyed making those movies because, especially on Suicide Squad, producing, when you're making a movie like that that's based on IP and that deals with characters that are very in the zeitgeist, that people are familiar with their characters or their looks in the comic books or maybe in some animated films, producing the actual movie is only really half the job of the producer on those projects. The other half of the job is really managing the brand as it relates to the movie. And our jobs as producers on those films are to protect the movie at all costs, but knowing that all of the other ancillary things that are going to come around that film are going to support your movie event. It's going to make it so as a producer, you really have to be a team player, in terms of being open-minded to a variety of different partnerships and spending the time and energy to develop the video games with them that are based on the characters they're creating in the movie. And, I spent a lot of time with Six Flags because they were doing a bunch of, Halloween Horror Nights for the characters and the worlds, and they were rebuilding our sets there. And so, like, it's really important for those movies to have a producer that, like, really is going to be involved in both the movie and the lifespan of the IP that you're unleashing onto the world. So those things come with so many things that fall into place with a movie. When you're making a movie, you're spending $175 million on a movie, and it's a movie like a DC film, you have to know that there's going to be rides and games and books and comic books and all sorts of things that are going to spin off of your movie and use your characters and your looks and your costumes and all of those things. The continuity aspect of that whole process is really important. You can't have the video game being developed based on your version of Suicide Squad that doesn't have, accurate costumes and accurate weapons and so all of those things to get that accuracy requires a producer that's very much integrated in the film and the art world of the film and the characters of the film that can also sort of guide the creative on rides, games, toys, all of the other stuff that comes along with it. And that's, as a studio, when you're making a movie like that, all of that other stuff is so important because it supports your movie. It brings people to your movie. I believe the studios all get licensing deals as well for all those toys and things. So, so back in the day, producers got a little piece of those licensing situations on those movies. So they made a little bit of money on those toys. These days, those deals don't really exist anymore. But yeah, so there's, I can go on and on. I'm curious if you guys have, I'm happy to also answer any questions about like that process too, because I was super integrated into the squad process when we were doing all the ancillary stuff on that movie.
No, I definitely want to talk more about that. Maybe first, Laura, thinking about some other aspects of IP, can you talk about bonds and some of the finance and defensive reasons?
Yeah, I mean, Andy is really in the business of making boatloads of money. The type of IP that I track down is a little different. I like finding esoteric, artistic stories sometimes that derive from life rights. And Andy has seen me track down and fly across the country to try to get life rights from people before. And it's actually one of my favorite pieces of the process. But to answer your question, Jess, the reason why IP is so important, and actually I think it informs the whole layer of gatekeeping within Hollywood, is it's a defensive strategy. So many films and some TV shows get bonded by insurance companies. And that is to insure against natural disasters, unforeseeable circumstances. Whoever is financing the movie in pre-production and production, sometimes post, things happen. And when these things happen, they call the insurance company and say, this was an unforeseeable circumstance and we need to resolve it. We need to be paid out for it. And it could be something as simple as an actor getting sick and the production needing to stop for a week or two, and you're having to pay salaries to people to keep them on board, to keep the production going. So, this is each movie and TV show is a huge orchestration of a lot of different people. And so you have to keep all the pieces aligned and together. And there's this one piece of the bond aspect, which is called E&O insurance. And E&O is for errors and omissions. And so for a completely original work, a screenwriter will sign a waiver saying, this is an absolutely, new work that's been created by me, and it becomes the intellectual property moving forward for the production. But if there is an underlying piece like a manga book or a comic book, like Andy's referencing, some sort of world that has been created elsewhere in a literary work, then you have to option and then purchase those life rights from the person that created it. And in a life right situation, you option and then purchase the life rights from that person. So just to drill down into that further, normally what happens is people like Andy and I, we have an eye for what we think is going to work as producers. And so we put together something called an option, because we don't necessarily know that even if it's a great idea, again, you have to align all of these pieces, packaging together directors and talent and lining up availabilities. So just because you have a great idea or great life rights or great IP doesn't necessarily mean that a project is going to happen right away. And so you option a piece of intellectual property from another party for, call it 12 to 18 months, and you usually get an extension for another 12 to 18 months, sometimes 6. It kind of just depends on what the situation is. And in that time, you're paying very small payments to the person who has owned the IP, and they're giving you the option to go out and put a package together, so that then a financier or a studio or a streamer can then do a direct deal with them later to say, okay, we're actually going to make this and finance the project, and they get a much larger, substantial payment later down the line. So I think that the gatekeeping mentality in Hollywood is really about like, a lot of people in Hollywood have to be careful about cross-pollination of outside ideas. Like if Barbie came out and there was a character called Laura Walker and she looked kind of similar to me, and I might try to bring a claim against the movie saying like you took my rights. Now if I had conversations with the producers before and there were email exchanges and I had the receipts, I actually might have a claim against the movie to be able to give me proceeds from the movie. And so oftentimes what happens is in Hollywood, there are things called unsolicited submissions. If you're not getting a screenplay or a book or something from a trusted source within the industry, you sign a submission release form just saying, I will read this, but I read 20 scripts a week. And if I make a movie 3 years in the future and it happens to have a character that has the same name as yours, you can't bring a claim against me in the future because these are creative ideas.
It happens all the time.
So Andy, if you have more.
We have a really strict unsolicited policy in my company for that exact reason. I think when I was at Atlas, I remember the early days there was a movie that we made, and there was, 4 years after we made the movie, there was a guy that came with a lawsuit that said, hey, I sent you guys a script 4 years ago. I never got a response from anybody, but I assume that someone got it because I didn't get a bounce back. And, I'm suing you for stealing my idea. That's just like a piece of a movie that we made. Now, obviously, that whole claim was BS. I will be honest and say that I never have heard of anyone stealing an idea of somebody that someone emailed them in town. It's a stupid thing to do. I don't know anyone that's ever done it, but there are a lot of writers that always feel like that's happening to them or may have happened to them, or there's a risk of it happening to them. And so, in that case, it got dismissed, but it cost us $25,000 to defend ourselves against that case. And then, we spent a year getting that $25,000 back from the person that brought it. And it was a whole, it took years for nothing. It was nothing. And so, when we were at Atlas and even in my current company, we have a really strict unsolicited policy that unless we get a piece of material from a agent, lawyer, or manager that we have a current working relationship with, we can't read it or accept it. And so all the time, I get things emailed to me all the time that are just like a log line and saying, hey, here's the log line. Can I send you my script? We have a very specific email that we reply with, which says, here's our unsolicited materials policy. We haven't read your email. In fact, we're deleting your email. If it had any attachments, we're deleting it. If you want to send us anything, it must come from a agent, manager, or lawyer that we have a working relationship with. And that's sort of how you get around that policy. Because if not, people would be suing everyone all over the place for potentially stealing their ideas. It's a really difficult thing. But I want to just go back really quickly and talk about some of the example. I want to give an example, Laura, of something that you were talking about as it relates to life rights and a bonding company. Because when we were making American Hustle, we had that exact situation that happened to us on American Hustle, where that movie was being made as an independent film, which means we had a bonding company on the movie. And we didn't need the life rights for every character that was involved in the movie, but there was one character in that movie that we made up a scene there's a very brief moment in that movie where the Amy Adams character is in a strip club, and she's on stage, and she looks like she's in a strip club and she's playing a stripper. And that scene lasts maybe 6 seconds in the movie. But because that character was based on a real person that existed, our bond company and we as producers worried that even though we didn't need her life rights because she's a public figure based on what that story was, that because we were inventing something for the sake of the movie, that we did then want to go get her life rights so then that she couldn't come after us. And so there was this moment on that movie where we were like less than a month out from starting to shoot the movie. We had spent a tremendous amount of money. We were so close to getting, and the bond company raised the flag of like, this is an issue for us that we don't have this life rights agreement because we're taking this liberty with this one little moment in this movie. And so we called up the woman. I think she was like in her late 80s, early 90s at the time. She was living in Florida in a retirement community. You know, she didn't really know kind of why we needed her life rights all of a sudden, but we decided like, hey, we're going to pay you for your life rights. And that really was just going to protect the movie. And so we put a member of our producing team on a plane with a $50,000 check that was like, less than a month out from shooting the movie. And at that moment, that person on that plane that was flying to Florida had the entire movie in his hands. If this didn't go well and she didn't accept the check or didn't want to sign a life rights agreement, the bonding company wouldn't have bonded the movie and we probably wouldn't have been able to make the movie. And so because of that, you know, he was like the hero of the time because it was so important that we got that life rights agreement. And you know, in a sense, that is a piece of IP. That is an agreement. That is IP for a real human being that contributed to what eventually became American Hustle. So those kind of situations happen all the time. You have to be very, very careful about, you know, when you're depicting real people, if you're taking creative liberties like that could be looked at as defamatory in some way, shape, or form. You really do have to protect yourself and make sure that you're above board with everybody.
And how do the actors respond to this, knowing like whether you have life rights or not, playing a real person? You know, again, Christian Bale, Bradley Cooper, Amy Adams. I mean, you have such great, such great talent there. What are kind of like the, you know, it usually goes this way, or how do people actually approach that?
I've always found that actors are usually incredibly respectful to the real person. They always want to meet them. They want to spend time with them. They want to hear their dialect and their voice and their mannerisms. They want to hear from them about what's important that we get right and what is not important. You know, all of those things. I've never run into a situation on true story stuff that I've ever done where an actor wasn't incredibly respectful to the real person involved. I think the only time, I'm trying to remember like what we had to be really careful in American Hustle because the FBI doesn't come off well in the movie. They're sort of, Bradley Cooper, who represents the NFL, the FBI, in the movie, that Bradley Cooper character in the movie is a combination of 4 FBI agents that were the actual real FBI agents that did all the things that we had just Bradley Cooper in the movie. And there was this day where there's a scene in the movie where they're sitting on a jet. And in the jet is, they've got Michael Pena dressed up as an Arab sheik. And they're having this conversation, and Bradley Cooper's on the plane, and Christian Bale's character's on the plane, and Michael Pena's character's on the plane. And they're having this conversation about sort of how ridiculous it is that we have like a Latino trying to pretend like he's an Arab sheik. And all of that, by the way, happened in real life. That day, when we were having this conversation, and the Bradley Cooper character was like a little bit buffoony, and the kind of stuff he was saying was a little bit embarrassing. That happened to be the day that the 4 FBI agents came to set, and they were watching that scene. And I remember they were sitting right next to me in Video Village, and they were a little bit unaware of kind of what was going on. And in that scene, the Christian Bale character is like very much on top of it. He's calling this stupid. He's telling Bradley Cooper he's stupid for even trying to think about this. And I remember very specifically the FBI agents assumed that the Christian Bale character was actually the FBI agent. And we sort of just let them believe it because we were just, they kind of like, they were just there for one day. And I started getting comfortable because I'm like, are they going to be upset that like we're sort of like depicting the FBI agent as kind of this like bumbling, dummy. But, the FBI made a lot of mistakes in that case. They did some really good work and they caught some bad guys. But there was a lot of stuff that would be looked at as like, not necessarily the right way to do things. But yeah, so that character was a combination of 4 FBI agents, and that happens all the time where you just sort of have to take creative liberties for the sake of time and storytelling in those kind of situations. But I've always every actor that I know that's played somebody that is still alive today has always been really respectful, and there's always each actor will have their own process in terms of what they feel like works best for them.
Yeah. So Laura, thinking about, different things you've optioned or tried to option, what's a lesson for, people who are intrigued with this world but haven't seen behind the curtain before?
I have a couple. One is, don't pay too much for intellectual property because it leverages you into every stage of the movie. And at some point, the film or the TV show becomes too expensive and you won't recoup. If you're not worried about recouping, don't worry about it. But who doesn't want to make money on the projects that they make? A project that comes to mind is actually a movie that's coming out in November called, or October actually. Yeah, Killers of the Flower Moon. So that movie was sourced from a book. And that book went out. I read it I think my head of development was like, I need you to read this tonight. This is really, really great. And I read it. It was really amazing. And I called the agency that was handling the rights, and studios were bidding like low to mid 6 figures for the book. And there was a lot of talent actually that was swirling around the book at that time, like Brad Pitt, George Clooney, DiCaprio, like people really wanted it.
Who did it end up with, by the way?
Packaging.
Who's in it?
It ended up with DiCaprio. He stars. Scorsese directs. Scorsese co-wrote the screenplay with Eric Roth. And all of those elements are very expensive. Anyway, I'll get to that in a little bit. But I called and I said, I want this book, not only because it's amazing, but there's a lot of activity around it. And packaging movies can be like the whole net drag on why a movie may or may not happen, because you have to align the windows. And oftentimes, if you want bankable elements or meaningful elements in a movie, it's because they're famous. And if they're famous, they're booked out for 9 months to 18 months, maybe even 3 years if it's a really great director. And so you end up waiting around for people to become available if you have like a coveted piece of material that talent really loves. So it's kind of like this catch-22 sometimes. So I thought, I think it's worth it to pay a premium for this book because I can package it right away and lock in their windows, and then we can get the screenplay written in the meantime. So I bid $2 million for the book. And like, when I say that like getting IP is one of my favorite elements actually of the movie making process, it's because you get to have meetings or phone calls like this. Like when I spoke to the author, David Gran, really lovely, intellectual guy, it was a very emotional phone call because, $2 million is life-changing for someone that has been toiling away on the book for several years. And I did put a clock on the offer. I just said, look, this is a very coveted property. I know a lot of people are pursuing you, and I need to know by tomorrow. And someone else swooped in that 24-hour period and paid. I actually don't know if I know what the number is, and I don't know if it was reported or not, so I probably shouldn't say, but they paid a lot more than I did.
It will be
I didn't pay
reported
anything.
very soon if it hasn't yet. They will definitely talk about it in the release of the movie that comes out soon.
I'm sure they will. And it's just way more than what anyone should pay for a piece of IP. So once you're in that much money, you've got to pay the very best writer to make sure that the screenplay is good, and that person's expensive. And then you have to pay the very best director to make sure that the execution of that screenplay is good, and the very best actors. Like you're really pot committed at that point from the very beginning, and you don't have a lot of flexibility. And look, I'm really happy because I can't wait to see that movie. But that's the first thing I would say. Be really careful about just throwing out a massive number because it snowballs over time. into your other commitments. The second scenario that I think of is know what you're buying. Like with intellectual property, really good books to buy are actually very boring books on the subject. You want boring, thick books on subject matter. Don't worry about style. You want to worry about content because, again, it's about the insurance company and the bond company and the strength of that intellectual property. So the more information that is in the property that you optioned, the more covered you are. But sometimes there are situations, especially life rights situations, where you have to be buying the right life rights. And the story that comes to mind actually involves Andy a little bit later, but I was in a bidding war for Bad Blood, which was the Elizabeth Holmes story. And that was like, I had heard about it. I'd heard whispers about it. I called Jennifer Lawrence's agent and I was like, these are all the reasons why you need to send me this project. And it was a preview of a manuscript that was printed on red pages. And that usually means that, you can't physically copy it. If it's on red pages, it's harder to read. It's very annoying.
There's an old Hollywood trick, that the whole red page thing, which is, if you try to photocopy a red page is black ink, you get just black pages. You don't really get much. And so that was the way before, to not let people copy things.
Right, exactly. And watermarks, obviously. And so I was like, I want to be on the list of people that reads this manuscript the day it goes out. And so I got myself onto the list, and I was supposed to be getting this manuscript at like noon that day. And it was 1 or 2 o'clock, and I hadn't received it yet. There had been a miscommunication at the agency. And so the investor that backs my family office and finances the movies that we work on, he has the same name as an executive at Legendary. Now, Legendary only knows how to make big movies. They don't know how to make small movies. They make great movies, but they only know how to make big ones. And when I found out, I lost it on this assistant, and I ended up getting my copy. I read it. I met with Adam McKay, who, I just revere as a filmmaker. I think he's so amazing. And we had really great meetings, and I put a bid in on the movie. And then who was I outbid by? Legendary. And they were never actually supposed to get the project. They only got it because there was a mix-up from the assistant. And because it wasn't a Legendary movie, it was based on, real life, and it was a drama. And you don't necessarily think of Legendary when you think of that type of movie, but they lucked into it. And so anyway, I licked my wounds over that, and I was at a dinner and I was explaining this story, and Andy was at this dinner, and Andy very coolly was like, call me tomorrow. You should be glad you didn't get that project. And so I called him. I'm like, what are you talking about? And then he told me the craziest story. Andy, you have to tell this story about what happened.
So on that project, obviously, the Elizabeth Holmes story was dominated the headlines for so long. And John Carey, who wrote the articles, who blew the story open, is the one that ended up writing that book that Laura was talking about. So everyone knew that book was coming. But when a story like that happens, you have lots of people trying to create their own IP based on a real story. And so what was happening on that situation was there was this feeding frenzy over this book, Bad Blood, that Legendary ended up buying for a wildly overpriced number. And then at the same time, there was this podcast that was being made called The Dropout, that was a really well-researched podcast that had lots of people that were involved in the story that were part of this podcast. That podcast became its own piece of intellectual property as well, that lots of producers were fighting over to turn into a TV series. And then there was a third project that was around on the same story that when my old company, were involved with. And that was us doing a deal directly with a guy named Tyler Schultz, who was the whistleblower of the entire Elizabeth Holmes saga. And so, you could have based it on the book. You could have based it on the podcast. You could have based it on the individual who was the whistleblower and his version of the story that hadn't been told yet. And so, when I told Laura, I said, listen, don't be so bummed, because I believe the chances that movie gets made at that studio are very low, because I know that there's this thing that we have. There's this TV series that's being made based on this podcast that exists. And so it was just like that story was so juicy and so ripe that there was lots of people planting their flags, their IP flags in that story. But at the end of the day, anyone could have really told that story. It was a very public story. You didn't really need IP to tell that story. It was helpful. And of course, the one that ended up getting made was The Dropout. It was a fantastic TV series that was, that came out last year, and they did a really nice job, and it will probably win awards. And, but that was the only one that actually ended up getting made. And there was a lot of money spent on the book and the life rights and all the other stories that were being made on that. And really IP is like, there's a lot of times when these articles, because the Carey articles were also being shopped around as well, in addition to his book. And so, articles go out all the time as IP too, and there's another example, that I can talk about, that there's a company out there that sort of creates articles for the sake of owning the IP of a true story. And it's kind of a dirty business, in my opinion, where you're essentially hiring a journalist to write an article about something that really happened, and then you now control the article, which means you control the IP, and now you can go sell the rights to the article to a studio. I don't know if that company is still around or if they're still able to do those things, but there's an example of that company actually coming to me with a story that they did this exact scenario on, where they hired a journalist to write a story based on a true story. And it was just sort of their bad luck that I actually knew one of the individuals that was involved in the real story that this was about. I didn't know one of the people specifically, but it was about an organization. And I had donated to that organization, and it was an animal rights organization. And so I was very well aware of them, and I had a direct relationship with them. And so when I got this article, I read the article. Wow, this is a great story. And I already know this organization, and I'm really excited about this, and yada, yada. And they were excited. And I just thought to myself, like, I'm going to call my friend at the organization and just go, hey, I'm so excited. Like, we're going to get involved in this article about the story. And their response to me was, what story? What are you talking about? And I was like, oh, you guys they didn't approach you? Like, they didn't even get your permission before writing this article about your story and then trying to sell the rights to the story to someone else, which means you guys will get nothing out of it. And you didn't even know what was happening, which means you guys would have read about it in the news after someone. And so I got really upset. I'm like, this is pretty gross. And this is this is not behavior that I want to be a part of. And so I told them, listen, like, I'm not going to be involved in this article. I don't like this whole situation. And they came to me and said, well, why don't we just work? If you think there's a movie based on this story, let's just work with you. Like, we have a relationship already. We'll give you our life rights, and we'll let you license our name. Screw that other article. Like, they didn't even talk. They were so disrespectful. They didn't even come to us. And so I found myself in this position where, it was a difficult position, because we opened ourselves up legally to reading the article that came to us and engaging on it somewhat, and then being involved in a situation where the actual people the article was about weren't happy with the people that wrote the article and wanted to work with us, and the article people wanted to work with us. And so we started to sort of engage in a life rights conversation, and I got like a legal letter from the people that controlled the article going like, hey, you can't do this without us because we sent you this article. So those kind of situations happen all the time. We used to there was a person that I know really well who used to have a phrase where he would say, there's no reason to option an article because really it's just an empty paper bag. There's really nothing in it. Like, you really need to go straight for the people involved, get their life rights, because an article doesn't really have any intrinsic value. The life rights of the people involved, if they're alive, that's where your value is in this. And so
yeah,
that's that specific thing, the article is just an empty paper bag is very specific to that situation that I dealt with on that project. And so that's, it's the Wild West in terms of like optioning articles and life rights and how you want to go about it. And everyone's going to have a different opinion about it. But to me, if you're making a movie about a real person that's still alive or an organization that exists, you should be going directly to them. Even if there's an article that comes out about them, work directly with them. They're going to, that's the respectful way to make a movie, in my opinion.
I totally agree. And I think that you'll save yourself a lot of headaches later. I mean, I think that one of the points of the Bad Blood story is that so many people were focused on Elizabeth Holmes that they weren't thinking about the actual whistleblower. And how can you tell the Elizabeth Holmes story without including the whistleblower, who is a private citizen? He's not considered a public figure. And so you have to, it ends up impacting the creativity of your story because you don't have those life rights. And if you don't handle it properly and you're not dealing directly with the people, especially if they're still alive, things can happen like the Aretha Franklin case. Aretha Franklin, I think maybe like 5-6 years ago, she filed an injunction against a movie that involved her, and it was supposed to premiere in Telluride, and they couldn't premiere it. And the premiere is really important when you're showing it to buyers because that's how you get your money back. That's your exit strategy. And so it's just better to do it. If you're dealing with life rights, go directly to those people. And if you want to option a really great article or book in addition, you can. But life rights, you really need to go to the people themselves.
So two questions. One, I want to go back to something you brought up before, Laura, about when you have to, if you pay too much for the IP, now you have to pay for the absolute best screenwriter. Price-wise, like price range-wise, either of you can weigh in on this or both of you. Let's start with you, Laura. Like thinking about a good scriptwriter to go book to script versus like the very best. What's the price range for a good one versus like the top of the industry ones?
Eric, I feel like Eric Roth is just so expensive.
I would guess Eric Roth is probably at least $2 to $3 million to write a script. And that, of course, is not just one draft. It's usually a draft and a set. It's a rewrite or two writes. It's about probably between $2 and $3 million. It's probably his number.
Like a good screenwriter
and just to drill down.
I would say
mid 6 figures to low 7 for like a well-known screenwriter. A lot of deals we do are anywhere between like $250,000 to $750,000, but we're working with like really established writers who have the chops, and some of them are writer directors. So you're getting the investment of their time so that you can then get them to the next stage. And for people who don't know, like when you're doing a deal with a screenwriter, it's like what Andy was saying. I don't want to just breeze over it. It's like you get a first draft, and then you get a reading period and a notes period, and then you get second draft, a reading period and notes period. Then you get a polish. Like it's all kind of to be negotiated, but these things happen in steps. You have to negotiate a process. So it's not like you're just giving money to a screenwriter and they're giving you something back, and what you get is what you get. That's not how it works. It's a collaborative process. And you're paying for the process to work with that creative.
Yeah. Normally, you're probably not going to spend more than $500,000 if that writer has not had a successful movie that's been made. I would say that's a really good barometer. If someone's coming to you and they've been hired to write a bunch of screenplays and their quote is pretty high, but they've never had anything made. The way my response sometimes there is like, well, you've written a bunch of scripts, but you haven't written any movies. And, there's a really big difference between writing a screenplay and writing a movie. Those are very big different situations there. And a lot of screenwriters have made millions of dollars throughout the course of their careers and never had one movie made. That is a problem in my opinion, because that means that they're good writers, but they're not writing movies. And so if you're paying anyone more than $500,000, you would hope that not only they have had at least 1 or 2 movies that have been made, but they will hopefully have been somewhat successful or somewhat critically regarded in some way, shape, or form. But if you're spending under $500,000, you can take a flyer sometimes on someone that you believe in is a great writer. They just made, for one reason or another, just haven't had a movie made. And that's, by the way, not always their fault as a writer. There's a number of reasons why movies don't get made, not necessarily just because the script wasn't good enough to get made. So lots of reasons could be, but if you're spending more than $500,000, you would hope that writer that you're paying has at least had something made that was either critically regarded or financially successful.
Yeah. So,
and also go ahead. If you're looking to take a temperature and the lawyers, you're friendly with them. I mean, they have to represent their clients' rights, obviously. But you can ask them for the writer's quote, like what's the best they've ever gotten paid by another entity. And the lawyer will tell you, and that'll give you a barometer of like a starting point. And you can say, well, we need to pay a little less because it's a very difficult movie. This is an indie movie. This is not that's that writer's studio quote. We're just an independent financier. Like you can you can ask for their quote, have a starting point that is unique to that writer, and then go up or down depending on what the situation is. So you're not just throwing darts in the dark.
Yeah, and that quote process usually is muddy. I think what people think they're worth and what they're actually worth are usually very different things. I think sometimes, a writer may find a really high net worth individual that will pay them $1 million to write a script. They just got lucky, right? And then all of a sudden now they believe that their quote is $1 million. And they go to the studios and they say the studios will ask them, "What's your quote?" And they'll say $1 million. So and so paid me $1 million, and the studio will go, "Oh, I don't care about that deal. That wasn't a studio deal. It was an independent deal. Like, good luck trying to ever get that. We'll pay you $250,000, and here's what's your studio quote." The studio quote is very different than what you've been paid as a writer for maybe outside the studio system. But the business has changed a lot in the past years. You're actually legally not allowed to even check quotes anymore. You used to be able to call other studios and business affairs departments and say, what did you pay this person the last time they wrote this? Because they're telling me that they got paid $1 million. Is that true? You're not allowed to do that anymore. So you sort of just have to take their word for it. But, those of us, obviously, that all it takes is 1 or 2 phone calls to really sort of be able to confirm that kind of behind the scenes. Like, did that person really get paid $1 million or are they really like a $300,000 writer? Because the agents will throw crazy numbers out. Sometimes you'll get paid. There's a lot of, Saudi Arabia deals and sort of Middle East financiers that are paying writers way, way, way more than they've ever gotten paid at a studio. And then sometimes those writers will try to use that as their quote, and the studios will kind of laugh them off the phone and go, "No chance we're ever matching that quote."
Maybe taking a slight different realm, thinking about IP and like its different forms. So many like true Batman fans think that the Christopher Nolan Batmans were the best movies, period, right? And I know, Andy, it was earlier in your career, but can you think about can you talk to us a little bit like, Batman, this is not the first time coming to the screen. There's been so many iterations and so many forms, let alone on screen. Looking at something like The Dark Knight, what those conversations are like, how that process looks with like really mature IP or very well used IP.
Yeah. I mean, with that movie, I remember, especially on Dark Knight, I remember Chris saying before making that movie that, he's not setting out to make the best Batman movie of all time. He wants to make a great movie that just so happens to have Batman in it. And so that was sort of like the mindset of making that movie. And I think that audiences react to those movies not only because they are all great movies, but they were the most grounded superhero movies in terms of like everything that happens in Dark Knight or Dark Knight Rises. For the most part, I would say at least 95% of what happens could theoretically happen in real life. Like you can actually relate to the things that like are happening in those movies because they feel real and grounded, and the characters are all very real and grounded. They just are. It's not like, we weren't spending insane amounts of money on entire visual effects set pieces, and there wasn't any powers or crazy lasers or like anything happening in those movies. They were like real movies about real people that just so happened to have superheroes in them or a superhero in it. And so I think that to me is one of the reasons why those movies will always stand the test of time and people love them so much, is because they were so different. And I think even if you look at all the superhero movies that have been made since then, none of them have really done that. I think the Joker movie is the only one that sort of, I think, has gotten close. The Joker movie, and then I think Logan, which did a really nice job with on that film as well. If you look at those movies, that people are they love these. There's certain superhero movies that they love, and I think that if you asked a bunch of people in town what are their favorites, I think the Dark Knight movies would be in there. I think Logan would be in there. I think Joker would be in there. I think Black Panther would probably be in there, although that's a little bit different. Wonder Woman is probably in there, although it's a little bit different. But a majority of them, I think, are the ones that feel the most real. They feel like they could actually happen in the world that we're living in today. If you look at some of the Marvel movies, especially most of the ones that are being made now, or Aquaman, or even the Superman movies, or the Batman Superman movies, or even Suicide Squad that I made, that stuff is like so wild and out there that there's a disconnect, I think, between what's actually happening in the movie and what people believe can happen in real life. But if you're watching a superhero film and it feels real and it feels like, hey, this actually could happen, especially with Batman, he's a regular guy. He's just a regular guy with a lot of money, and a lot of resources. Audiences really look at that stuff, and the sort of the wish fulfillment side of it, and the putting themselves in those shoes of how would I react if this was happening in the world that we live in today. All of that stuff works for those movies, but not for a lot of the other movies that are being made today that I think are causing superhero fatigue. So I think that to me and that was one of them. Obviously Chris Nolan is a genius and a master, and I think there's very few people that like him that have ever directed a superhero movie as well. And when you give someone like that, a character like Batman, you're probably going to get, it's why when I gave James Mangold, Logan, like, holy shit, that movie was amazing as well. Like, that movie made me cry. And I'm like, this is a Wolverine movie. It's making me cry. But they all sort of feel like they're in the same world in terms of, like, these all feel very real. And I think the realer you can make them feel and the more grounded you can make them, I think that's really what audiences really want. I think they want to feel like what's happening in that superhero movie maybe could happen in the world we live in today, possibly, like that I think helps. That idea helps.
I agree, Andy, on the realness. I mean, I think that Barbie was created in the 1950s, and obviously, it's reached $1.2 billion now. And a lot of that has to do with, generations of audiences being used to the brand and going. But I think where it really gets set apart, and so many of the op-eds reflect this, is like, I think about like America Ferrera's monologue about being a woman in the world today and how it's so difficult. There's all these expectations to be this way and that way and this way and that way. And they layered on like the realness of the world on top of the Barbie brand. And I think it really resonated with audiences in a way where they're not seeing it once, they're seeing it twice.
Yeah. A lot of people are seeing it multiple times. That movie is like, I think that movie will be studied for years and years to come about how you take IP that's based on the doll that has absolutely no story, there's no narrative within that toy. And they created something that was amazing, really. But not only did they do that with the movie, if you look at how they marketed the films, they had over 100 promotional partners that they used on those movies to do crazy things like the Airbnb Barbie house that was in Malibu, and just partnerships all over the world. I mean, the promotions department of Warner Brothers was just firing on all cylinders, as was the marketing department on that movie. And they went all in, and it really paid off. It really did. And I think when you can do that, yes, you need a good movie for it to make money, but all of those other things have to be done as well around the movie. It's how we, I'll be one of the first to admit, like, I'm not going to say Suicide Squad was an amazing movie, but all of the things that we created around the movie was what made that movie, it made $750 million. So super successful. You need both of those, both the movie and the promotional aspect of it and the marketing aspect to be firing on all cylinders. And when you get that, you get $1 billion gross. Like that's usually what will end up happening.
Well, and there's also like a level of self-honesty around the marketing for like the current state about IP from the 50s and like the backlash about Barbie. Like, when they have their own ads that say, if you hate Barbie, you'll love this movie. Like, who puts that? Like, that takes some guts from a marketing department, right?
Yeah. That was like that's rule number one at a studio. Like, never use the word you're going to hate anything. Like, and I remember, Josh Wolfson, who runs marketing, he said that, like, when Greta Gerwig was the one that came up with that slogan, like, this is for people that love Barbie and this is for people that hate Barbie. And, they argued about that in their marketing meetings. Like, should we really do this? And that, it's one of the lines that you remember about the marketing campaign of the movie, because like they took a big swing. They did something different, and it really paid off for them. And that movie, like, they also took a massive risk by, nobody knew what that movie was about, what the story was going into that movie. The trailers told you nothing about what the story of the movie was. You didn't even know, if I bring my 6-year-old daughter, is she going to understand this movie? Like, is she going to get what's going on? If I is it only for adults? Like Barbie, is it for kids? Like, no one knew. It was entirely word of mouth driven, really. It was like, it's just Barbie, just go. And people were just going. And, even friends of mine that had 6, 7, 8-year-old daughters that brought them to the movie, I asked them, I said, did they understand what was going on? And half of them said no, but they still loved it. And years from now, they will revisit it. And then they will a lot of things they'll be realizing certain things that they didn't understand because they were so young, but they all had a good time watching the movie. They just did, like, that movie really, they deserve every bit of that 1.2 that they're at, and it will continue to go up. I mean, that movie's not slowing down anytime soon. They're going to keep making money on it for a while.
I know we're over time, but if you bring up Barbie, we got to do like the full Barbenheimer. So, Andy, why don't you kick us off talking about Oppenheimer?
I mean, Barbenheimer, by the way, that whole idea was genius. Like the idea that they tied these two movies together that are so different, and they sort of put them against each other. And by the way, that required no cooperation between studios. That happened organically on the internet. And so that's not like either one of Universal or Warner Brothers came up with this idea to like put these two movies against each other for the battle of the summer. It just organically happened because you had two mega movies that were opening on the same date, which is never a thing that you ever want as a studio or a producer or a director. You never want your giant $200 million movie opening up against another one on the same date. You're going to want to spread that out. These two movies, they were just playing a game of chicken, and everyone in town was waiting, like, who's going to move? Someone's going to move off this date, And I knew Chris Nolan not moving off that date. He has released every single movie that he's ever made on that exact weekend in July. He's not moving. It's not happening. Let's also not forget that Chris Nolan very sort of famously left his relationship at Warner Brothers to go make Oppenheimer at Universal. It's the first movie he made at Universal in his whole career, in a very sort of like, not throwing his middle finger up, but like it was not a nice situation that happened. Warner Brothers assumed they were going to get every Chris Nolan movie. They've made every Chris Nolan movie. He decided, in this one, I'm going to take it out to the other studios and see who makes more sense. So his old studio was making Barbie. It was like this massive showdown that was happening, and neither one of them blinked, and they just went for it. Oppenheimer was one. It was one of the last movies that we had made at Atlas when I was there. And that was based on a book that had been around for a long time. It was like a 700-page book. And I remember like when we got it and I had started looking at it. And of course, my first, when you're reading so many books is like to evaluate films, there's usually a process in terms of how you read them. You don't usually read all 600 or 700 pages. We usually will read like, if it's a book that big, you'll read like the first 150 pages and maybe the last like 60 or 70 pages to decide if you feel like it's good enough to maybe warrant a film. On that one, I remember reading it and talking to Chuck and going like, who's making this movie? Like, this is a period movie. It's a 600-page book that's been around for like 20 years. They've tried a million times to turn this book into a movie. It hasn't worked. It's a dark story. This was like coming out of COVID and people didn't really want dark movies. It's about the guy that, those are all the things swirling around. And I think not just my head at the company that was making the movie or had sort of, absorbed the option of the movie, but everyone around town for many years was aware of that book and no one decided to make the movie for all these reasons that I just discussed. It just sort of like was the right time and the right place, the right filmmaker that wanted to make a movie based on this individual. And he wanted to use this book as reference to be able to frame his movie around. And like, that's like winning the lottery in terms of like having an option for a book that no one's wanted to make for however long it's been out, 20 plus years. And, Chuck Roven got the option for the book and brought it to a filmmaker that he had worked with on the Batman movies. And, it all just sort of like came together in this way that is like, it's why we call every movie in town a miracle, because for every movie to happen, it takes all of these things to come together for it to actually get to the point of like you sitting in a movie theater and watching it on a big screen. That one in particular, it's amazing to see what happened. And now, they're going to make over $600 million on that movie soon. And that's a 3-hour drama, a 3-hour period drama that's crossing the $600 million mark and is going to continue to go. And in my opinion, deserves every bit of every dollar that's made and will more than likely be, nominated for multiple Oscars and Golden Globes. And, so that story I think is like, it's a really good one in terms of like, hey, if you're persistent enough, David Wargo, who had the original option on that book, who was not a film guy at all, was getting very frustrated and was giving up and was at the point of giving up, and they had brought the book to Atlas, and then like, sure enough, it became a Chris Nolan movie 2 years later. Like, but he had struggled for 20 years before that. So that's just kind of how it happens. it's very much right time, right place, right filmmaker. All of those things have to happen once for a movie like that to actually happen.
That's awesome. Well, I mean, you referenced The Dropout. I think let's do another episode specifically talking about the niche of podcast to movie space. Talk about Chameleon. Anybody wants to get ready for that episode, you need to go listen to Andy's podcast. He's a part of Chameleon. There's some other great ones out there. Before we maybe end here, let's do plugs for you guys. Andy, if people want to learn more about Big Swell or connect with you or follow you on the internet, like where Instagram, LinkedIn, website, what are the best places?
Yeah, Instagram is the best place to get a hold of me. It's probably where I'm the most active, and it's just at Andy Horowitz on Instagram. Big Swell is my company. We are about to have a very, very cool few movies that are once the strike is over, and we can, we've packaged a bunch of films that we're ready to go look for financing on very soon, and 2 of which I think will come together very quickly as soon as both the writers and the actors make a deal. But yeah, that's the best place to find me would be Instagram, which is at Andy, ANDYHORWITZ.
Yeah. Don't put an extra O in there, people. Come on.
Leave it out.
Okay, Laura, same thing. People want to connect with you on social. They want to know more about AG. They want to know more about Madre.
Yeah. Laura Walker Lee on socials for me. And then Madre VC on all social media channels. We don't have as much for AG Capital. We're a little more stealth and in the industry with that, just because we're not looking for unsolicited material. Yeah, that's where you can find me.
And please don't send us log lines or scripts or ideas. we unfortunately will have to send you one of those nasty little letters back saying that we can't read it and that we delete it.
Okay. How do they find out what lawyers to work with that you actually trust? Or agents, or...
there's a IMDb Pro is not a very expensive tool to use to start looking up. The way I would suggest to do it would be find your favorite filmmakers or your favorite writers or your favorite directors and look who their lawyers are, and then click on that law firm, and you're going to see about 25 other lawyers that also work at that law firm. And I would aim for one of the younger ones, so one of the ones that maybe doesn't have a lot of millionaire clients, and write to that person. Usually it's very tricky because lawyers and agents and managers lawyers specifically aren't going to represent you unless they feel like there's a situation that's presenting itself where you're about to make some money on something. And so if you're just a screenwriter that's sort of trying to get your script out there, I wouldn't start with a lawyer. I would start with a manager is where I would suggest to start, because a manager is actually reading unsolicited scripts. They're allowed to do that. And so managers read unsolicited scripts, as do agents. But managers will have more time to read. They're going to spend more time trying to sort of... And then your manager, if they read your script or your idea and like it, they will then guide you to a lawyer and an agent eventually when the time is right. But most lawyers aren't going to spend the time unless you have a situation where there's like a deal being presented to you and you may need a lawyer to help. And in that situation, a lawyer may take a flyer on someone new. But I would start with a manager. And the same way to find those people is exactly what I just described. Go to IMDb Pro, find your favorite writers and your favorite directors. Look who their agents and managers are. Look who some of the younger, more junior managers or agents are at that agency or that company, and reach out to those people. And those people will definitely help. If they read your script and they like it, they will guide it into the right hands in the business.
Great.
Can I add a footnote to that?
Why don't you add the footnote and end us off here today?
Okay. I'm not good at the sign off. Jess,
Okay.
You got to do the sign off. I think the footnote is that law firms, they usually charge a monthly retainer to producers because producers generate so much churn for them. Directors and actors do not. So if you are somebody that does have money to spend, you're trying to make things happen, you're trying to get your into the industry, contact Andy or Jess, or do what Andy said, which is go to IMDb Pro, figure out, the creatives that you really like, figure out who their lawyers are, get in contact with them and say, look, I'm starting out, but I'm really serious about this. I'm willing to pay your retainer for you to advise me. You can start getting introductions that way. And I've seen people do it that way to pretty great effect as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. I was actually more specific on the 5% side of the, some lawyers would just make 5% of what you make. And so usually if you're not paying a retainer, they're not going to do the 5% deal unless you have a deal in front of you or have a track record of already working in the business.
Yep.
Okay, you guys, this is awesome.
And
I'm looking forward to the next one. I think we should also do one that's like, I know it sounds basic to you guys, but like I think we should go through like agent, manager, lawyer, what do they do? What do they not do? A CAA, a William Morris, an Atlas, a big swell, and like just help people start figuring out like, I think 99% of Americans would be like, couldn't tell you the difference between the agent and the manager. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it obviously, there are significant differences. So great. Okay, folks. Thanks everybody for listening. And thanks, Laura and Andy, for doing another one of these episodes.
Thank you.
Bye now.
So fun.